November 1965. London, England. A secret meeting takes place between representatives of the United States and United Kingdom. The topic, a remote archipelago in the Indian Ocean that most Americans have never heard of, called the Chagos Islands. The population approximately 1,500 people who had lived there for generations. Building a unique culture and calling it home. The plan removed every single one of them to make way for a military base that required an uninhabited island. The justification given by military planners' strategic necessity during the Cold War. With no room for local political complications or democratic rights. The price, $14 million. Cleverly disguised as a discount on Polaris nuclear missiles to avoid congressional scrutiny and public attention. In 1966, the deal was signed without any congressional oversight, parliamentary debate, or consultation with the people who actually lived there. A confidential memo from British diplomat Dennis Greenhill summarized the cynical strategy with shocking callousness. Unfortunately, along with birds go some few Tarzans. He continued with even more racist language and Man Fridays whose origins are obscure and who are being hopefully wished on to Mauritius. Translation: there are people living on these islands, and the British government planned to pretend they didn't exist as permanent inhabitants. This is the story of Diego Garcia. The only place on Earth where an entire population was systematically erased for a military base. Not relocated with dignity and compensation. Not consulted about their future. Erased from their homeland, as if they had never existed. This wasn't traditional colonialism, where powers extracted resources while governing populations. It was ethnic cleansing with a Cold War alibi justifying every crime. And 50 years later, the people who were born there, whose parents and grandparents were born there, still cannot go home. The Chagos Archipelago is a scattering of 52 coral atolls in the central Indian Ocean, a tropical paradise of pristine waters. The location is strategically perfect, halfway between Africa and Indonesia, equidistant from the east coast of Africa and the Indonesian island of Aceh, outside the cyclone belt. Blessed with a deep, natural harbor and perfect climate, it was geographically ideal for military purposes, but economically worthless. For centuries, it remained an agricultural backwater of the British Empire, known only for coconut plantations and a quiet, isolated existence. French colonists arrived in the late 1700s, bringing enslaved people from Madagascar and Mozambique to work the coconut plantations for copra production. The British seized control in 1814 under the Treaty of Paris, and for the next 150 years administered it quietly. The Chagos Islands were governed as a dependency of Mauritius, another British colony, with minimal attention from London and little economic importance. The population grew slowly. Families formed, intermarried, and established roots. A unique culture emerged that blended African, Malagasy, and Indian influences. Chagossian Creole language developed. Distinct music traditions flourished. A society was built on fishing, coconut harvesting, subsistence agriculture, and communal life. By the 1960s, approximately 1,500 people called the Chagos Islands home, living peacefully across the three main inhabited atolls. Most lived on Diego Garcia, the largest atoll with the best harbor. Others settled on Peros Banhos and Salomon atolls nearby. They weren't indigenous in the strictest anthropological sense, since their ancestors had been brought there as slaves rather than evolving there. But they had lived on these islands for 5, 6, 7 generations with no memory of living anywhere else in the world. No one alive in the 1960 seconds remembered their ancestors arriving. To them, this was not a colonial possession but their ancestral homeland. To the Chagossians, these islands weren't British territory or French plantations. They were home in the deepest, most fundamental sense of the word. In the late 1950 seconds, American military planners working at the Pentagon identified a critical strategic problem for U.S. global power projection. The Soviet Navy was expanding aggressively into the Indian Ocean, establishing relationships with newly independent nations, and threatening Western shipping routes. The United States had military bases scattered across the Pacific and Atlantic, but absolutely nothing in the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean. No refueling stations for naval vessels, no logistics hubs for supplies, no ability to project military power into a region of growing importance. A civilian strategist named Stuart Barber, working for the U.S. Navy at the Pentagon, proposed an elegant solution to this strategic gap. The strategic island concept: systematically acquire remote, low-population islands around the world for exclusive military purposes, avoiding political complications that populated areas create. The criteria were specific islands far from potential Soviet threats, islands with no economic value that other nations might contest, islands nobody wanted. Diego Garcia fit every single criterion perfectly, like it had been designed by nature for this exact strategic purpose. Geographic location: Central Indian Ocean with access to Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Strategic value immense for both naval and air operations. Population small enough to be manageable, or so the planners initially thought, before deciding even a small population was too much. In 1958, the United States approached the United Kingdom with a proposal that would change the lives of 1,500 people forever. We want to build a military base on Diego Garcia to counter Soviet expansion and maintain Western dominance in the Indian Ocean. But we have one absolutely non-negotiable requirement. The island must be completely uninhabited, with no local population whatsoever to complicate operations. No local population meant no political complications, no democratic rights to navigate, no inconvenient questions about self-determination or human rights. The British government, eager to maintain its special relationship with Washington and gain access to American nuclear technology, agreed immediately to the plan. But there was a significant complication that threatened to derail the entire scheme before it could even begin. Mauritius was about to become independent. Mauritius, which administered the Chagos Islands as a dependency, was scheduled for independence in 1968 as part of Britain's decolonization process. If Chagos remained part of Mauritius when independence came, the new democratically elected government might refuse to host an American military base. Worse still, under United Nations decolonization rules, the UK would have to regularly report on any colony with a permanent indigenous population. The solution devised by British and American officials was surgical, cynical, and a clear violation of UN General Assembly Resolution 1514 on decolonization. In November 1965, 3 years before Mauritian independence, the UK unilaterally detached the Chagos archipelago from Mauritius without popular consultation or democratic mandate. It created a new colonial entity called the British Indian Ocean Territory, or Biot, Britain's last colony in Africa to this day. Mauritius was compensated £3 million for the permanent loss of territory, a sum that would be worth approximately $63 million today. In 1968, Mauritius became independent from Britain as planned, but it became independent without the Chagos Islands, which remained under British control. The Biot remained a British colony with no elected government, no constitution, no democratic representation, governed entirely by decree from London, and under complete British control. It could be leased to the United States for military purposes without any interference from elected officials. On December 30, 1966, the UK-US exchange of notes was signed in secret, establishing the legal framework for America's presence. The United States received a 50-year lease on Diego Garcia for military purposes, with an automatic option to extend for another 20 years. The terms were extraordinarily generous to Washington. The base would operate under exclusive U.S. jurisdiction, with minimal British oversight or involvement. No rent would be paid by the United States. The only compensation, a $14 million discount on Polaris submarine-launched ballistic missiles. This was not a formal treaty requiring ratification. It was an executive agreement, a form of international deal that doesn't require legislative approval. It required no approval from the US Congress, no debate in the British Parliament, no public disclosure, no democratic accountability whatsoever. It was classified at the highest levels. The American public didn't know the deal existed, and the British public was kept entirely in the dark. And buried deep in the agreement's text was the critical clause that would seal the fate of 1,500 people uninhabited island required. The island must be available for defense purposes without local inhabitants to ensure smooth operations, without political complications or humanitarian obligations. This is where the crime against humanity begins, documented in declassified memos that reveal the cold calculation behind the forced removals. In 1966, Diego Garcia had a recorded population of 924 people living in a functioning community with homes, schools, and churches. But British officials needed that number to be zero to fulfill their promise to Washington. So they invented a transparent legal fiction. The Chagossians were not permanent inhabitants with rights under international law. They were merely contract laborers or transient workers with no legal standing. A confidential memo from the British Colonial Office in 1966 explained the cynical strategy with shocking frankness: maintain the fiction that they're not permanent. The purpose is to maintain the fiction that the inhabitants of the Chagos are not a permanent or semi-permanent population deserving of rights. British government lawyers reviewing the plan acknowledged this fiction was rather transparent and unlikely to withstand serious scrutiny from international bodies. But they determined it gave them a defensible position to take up at the UN if questions were asked about the forced removals. The legal gymnastics were deliberate. If the Chagossians weren't permanent inhabitants, they had no right to remain, no right to return, no rights at all. In 1967, the British government quietly purchased the Chagos Agalega Company, which owned and operated the coconut plantations, for £660,000. Then, with full control of the island's economy and transportation, they began a systematic campaign to make life impossible for the Chagossians. They stopped shipping adequate food supplies to the islands. Rice shipments that families depended on were reduced to starvation levels, creating artificial shortages. Medicines stopped arriving regularly. Medical emergencies that once meant a quick trip to Mauritius now became life-threatening situations with no help available. The ships that connected the islands to Mauritius, the lifeline for the community, began running less frequently, isolating the population from the outside world. Chagossians who traveled to Mauritius for medical treatment, family visits, or routine business found they couldn't board the ship back to their homes. They were told their contracts had expired. The islands were closed. They were no longer allowed to return to the place they were born. Families were separated overnight. Parents frantically searched for children who had gone to Mauritius for school and suddenly couldn't come back home. People who left Diego Garcia for a 2-week visit found themselves stranded in Mauritius for the rest of their lives, never seeing home again. By 1969, approximately 200 to 300 Chagossians had been stranded in Mauritius through this cruel administrative tactic of refusing return passage. This initial measure displaced an estimated 10 to 15% of the resident population without any physical removal from the islands themselves. By 1971, the population of Diego Garcia had been significantly reduced through attrition, deception, and deliberate starvation tactics. But hundreds still remained on other atolls. In March 1971, U.S. Navy Seabees, the Naval Construction Battalions, arrived on Diego Garcia to begin construction of the communication station and military facilities. The plantation manager, now working directly under Bayat administration, controlled from London, received explicit orders from British officials. All remaining Chagossians must be removed. What happened next is documented in sworn testimony from survivors, legal filings in British courts, and declassified memos that reveal the systematic cruelty. British officials ordered the extermination of all dogs on Diego Garcia, including the beloved pets that had been part of Chagossian families for generations. The dogs were rounded up systematically. They were herded into the plantation's furnaces and gassed. Their bodies were burned in front of the islanders. One Chagossian woman, Rita Elise, described what she witnessed in testimony that still brings people to tears. They put all the dogs in furnace, and when their dogs were taken away from them, the people screamed and they cried because these were their family members, their children's companions. This was not a public health measure to control disease. It was deliberate psychological warfare designed to terrorize the population into submission. The message was unmistakably clear: if we can kill your dogs without consequence, what do you think we will do to you if you resist? In April 1971, the remaining Chagossians on Diego Garcia were formally informed that they would be forced to leave their homes within 3 months. John Rawling Todd, the British plantation manager carrying out orders from London, delivered the devastating news in a brief, callous meeting with community leaders. I told the inhabitants that we intended to close the island in July. He later testified in legal proceedings about the forced deportations. Some Chagossians, still not fully understanding the permanence of what was happening, asked if they would receive compensation for leaving their own country. Todd's response, recorded in his own testimony, reveals the contempt with which they were treated. I kicked this into touch by saying minimal disruption. He promised that the British government intended to cause as little disruption to their lives as possible. A grotesque lie given what was about to happen. In July and September 1971, cargo ships arrived at Diego Garcia to complete the final phase of the forced deportation of the remaining population. The Chagossians were loaded onto vessels, originally designed to transport coconuts and plantation supplies. Not human beings, in any humane or dignified manner. The ships were overcrowded beyond any reasonable capacity. There was no sanitation, no shelter from the blazing tropical sun, no medical care for the sick. Families were told they could bring one small suitcase per person. Everything else must be left behind: furniture, tools, photographs, everything that made life. Homes they had built with their own hands. Cemeteries where their parents and grandparents were buried. Churches where they had worshipped for generations. The graves of their ancestors, some marked with headstones, some remembered only in family stories, would be abandoned to the jungle forever. The ships sailed hundreds of miles to Mauritius and the Seychelles, taking the Chagossians to places many had never been, places that felt alien. When the ships arrived and docked, the Chagossians were simply left on the docks like cargo, with no housing, no jobs, no plan. No resettlement assistance was provided, no job training, no housing support, no compensation for the lives they had lost or the property they'd been forced to abandon. Many had never lived in a modern city with paved roads and electricity. They didn't speak the local Mauritian or Seychellois languages fluently beyond basic communication. They had no identification documents, no birth certificates, no proof of who they were or where they had come from that would allow them legal residency. They were stateless refugees in countries that didn't want them, marked immediately by their different accent, different customs, different skin tone as outsiders. Louis Marcel Humbert, a Chagossian deported to Mauritius, described the arrival that destroyed his family in testimony recorded decades later by human rights investigators. Life was easy in Chagos. It was like paradise. We fished. We harvested coconuts. We had food. We had community. We had everything we needed. I was very sad when I realized we wouldn't be able to go back, that this wasn't temporary, that our entire world was gone forever. My mother cried and said to us, "Now we will live a very different life." And that's when the nightmare started for our family. Chagossians arriving in Mauritius and the Seychelles faced immediate, systematic discrimination from locals who saw them as primitive, diseased, and inferior to urban populations. They were called anora, meaning unvaccinated or disease-ridden, because they hadn't received the vaccines common in cities, making them seem backward and dangerous. They were called Mozambique, a deeply racist term meaning uncivilized or savage, reflecting both their African ancestry and their isolated, rural island background. Their national ID cards in the Seychelles bore a distinctive number 5 in a special category, permanently marking them as Chagossian and making discrimination effortless. Employers could see at a glance they were Chagossian and refuse them jobs. Landlords could reject their housing applications. Banks could deny them loans or credit. They lived in slums on the outskirts of cities, in homes built from corrugated metal scraps, held together with mud and cow dung. Unemployment was rampant among Chagossian communities. Those who found work were paid less than locals, exploited for their desperation and lack of legal protections. Malnutrition became common. Children died from preventable diseases. Mothers reported their breast milk drying up from the stress, malnutrition, and emotional devastation of exile. One woman described how her infant brother died within months of arrival in Mauritius because her mother, traumatized by the deportation, couldn't produce milk to feed him. Elderly Chagossians who had spent their entire lives on Diego Garcia died in exile, heartbroken, never seeing their homeland again, buried in foreign soil. The emotional devastation was so profound that Chagossians developed a specific word for it, chagrin, meaning a deep soul sadness caused by separation from homeland. Chagrin wasn't just homesickness. It was a cultural concept, describing the physical and psychological pain of being torn from your land, your identity, your reason for existing. Many Chagossians believe that chagrin killed as many people as the poverty and disease that followed the deportations, a death of the spirit before the body. In 1972, 15 years after the deportations, the British government finally acknowledged some responsibility and agreed to pay minimal compensation through the Mauritian government. The total compensation for destroying 1,500 lives, $6,000 per person, for those who could prove they were legitimate Chagossian belongers with documentation. Many Chagossians received absolutely nothing because they had no birth certificates or documents proving they were born in Chagos, which had never issued such papers. The compensation, when it did arrive, was a one-time payment with no ongoing support, no housing assistance, no job training, no pathway to rebuilding lives. To put this in perspective, $6,000 per person for losing their homeland, their livelihoods, their community, their culture, their entire world forever. In 1973, Naval Support Facility Diego Garcia became fully operational, transformed from a pristine tropical atoll into one of America's most important military installations worldwide. The base expanded dramatically over the following decades as geopolitical events, especially the Iranian Revolution and Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, increased its strategic importance. The island's lagoon was dredged to create a deep ship channel, turning basin, and berthing space for aircraft carriers and nuclear submarines. The runway was extended to 11,000 feet, long enough to accommodate B-52 bombers, C-17 cargo aircraft, and any plane in the American military inventory. Massive fuel storage facilities were built, eventually storing enough fuel oil to make Diego Garcia handle the largest volume of any Navy facility in the world. By the 1,980 seconds, Diego Garcia had become what American officials called an all but indispensable platform for security operations across 3 continents. The base played critical roles in the Gulf War, the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, with B-52 and B-1 bombers launching strikes from its runways. It served as a logistics hub for operations across the Middle East, South Asia, and East Africa, supporting naval operations for the 7th Fleet. Diego Garcia was also revealed to have served as a CIA black site, where suspected terrorists were held and interrogated outside of any legal framework. The strategic value to the United States has been measured in the trillions of dollars over 50 years of continuous operations in the Indian Ocean region. Meanwhile, the Chagossians scattered across 3 countries, Mauritius, the Seychelles, and eventually the UK, fought a long legal battle for the right to return home. In 2000, a British High Court ruled that the 1,980 971 Bayat immigration ordinance used to expel them was unlawful, giving Chagossians hope they could return. But in 2004, under intense pressure from the United States, which needed the base for the war on terror, the British government overturned that decision, using the royal prerogative, an ancient monarchical power that bypasses Parliament. The government issued orders in council permanently banning Chagossians from ever returning to any island. In 2008, the UK House of Lords, the highest court in Britain at the time, ruled definitively against the Chagossians, condemning them to permanent exile. In 2019, the International Court of Justice ruled that the UK's continued administration of the Chagos archipelago was illegal under international law and violated decolonization principles. The UN General Assembly voted overwhelmingly, 116 nations in favor, that the UK must return the Chagos Islands to Mauritius as soon as possible. But the UK dismissed the ruling as non-binding and refused to comply, continuing to maintain the Bayat as a colony and blocking Chagossian return. In February 2023, Human Rights Watch issued a damning 106-page report titled, "That's When the Nightmare Started," analyzing 50 years of Chagossian suffering. The report concluded that the continuing forced displacement of the Chagossians, the prevention of their permanent return, and their persecution on racial grounds amount to crimes against humanity. Crimes against humanity, including deportation and persecution on racial grounds, were defined in the 1945 Nuremberg Charter drafted by the US and UK governments themselves. The irony is devastating. The United States and United Kingdom established the legal framework defining crimes against humanity, then committed those exact crimes against the Chagossians on October 3, 2024. After prolonged negotiations, the UK finally announced it would return sovereignty over the Chagos Islands to Mauritius in a historic deal. But the agreement contained a critical clause that revealed nothing had fundamentally changed. The United States must be allowed to continue operating the Diego Garcia base. For an initial period of 99 years, the UK will retain authority to exercise sovereign rights over Diego Garcia, ensuring continued American military operations. The Chagossians, despite decades of legal battles, protests, and international support, were not consulted about their own homeland's future or given a seat at negotiations. The agreement allows Mauritius to begin planning for resettlement of the other Chagos Islands. But Diego Garcia, where most Chagossians were born, remains permanently off limits. Frankie Bontemps, a Chagossian activist living in exile in the UK, expressed the community's bitter disappointment. "Our people were sacrificed for Mauritius's independence, for this base, for the defense purposes of the West. But what about us? What do we get in return? Life in exile, another 99 years of exile." His grandmother, now in her 80s, was born on Diego Garcia. Under this agreement, she will die in exile, never allowed to return to her birthplace. There are approximately 10,000 Chagossians today, scattered across Mauritius, the Seychelles, and the United Kingdom, maintaining their culture in diaspora as best they can. Many deliberately hide their Chagossian identity to avoid discrimination, changing their accents, avoiding the distinctive Chagossian Creole language in public spaces to blend in. The younger generations, born in exile, learn about the Chagos Islands from photographs and stories, inheriting a longing for a homeland they've never seen. So why did the UK steal an island from its own colony and give it to the United States, destroying 1,500 lives in the process? Because in the Cold War calculus of the 1,960 seconds, geopolitical strategy and military advantage outweighed human rights, international law, and basic human decency completely. The strategic island concept that Stuart Barber proposed wasn't about defending freedom. It was about controlling geography with zero political accountability or humanitarian constraints. Diego Garcia was perfect because it was remote, strategically located, and had a small population that could be removed without significant international attention or consequences. The UK cooperated because it desperately wanted to maintain its special relationship with Washington and gain access to American nuclear missile technology at discounted prices. $14 million off the cost of Polaris missiles was the price of 1,500 human lives. Their culture, their homeland, their entire existence. The legal fiction that Chagossians weren't permanent inhabitants was transparent, cynical, and deliberately designed to evade UN oversight and international humanitarian law obligations. British officials knew they were violating decolonization principles. They knew they were lying about the population. They simply didn't care because geopolitics mattered more. A confidential memo from British diplomat Anthony Aust in 1968 revealed the government's position with brutal honesty. There is nothing wrong in law or principle. Even in international law, there is no established rule that a citizen has a right to enter or remain in his country of origin, birth, or nationality. We have not ratified Protocol 4 to the European Convention on Human Rights, so we don't regard the UK as bound by such rules about return. Translation: we can get away with this because we've deliberately not signed treaties that would make it illegal. And no one will stop us. The racism was explicit in government documents. Calling Chagossians Tarzans and Man Fridays wasn't casual insensitivity. It was dehumanization, justifying ethnic cleansing. If they're not really people with rights, if they're just primitive natives with obscure origins, then removing them isn't a crime. It's administrative cleanup. The United States insisted on an uninhabited island, not for operational security, but to avoid political complications. Democratic accountability, and the messy reality of governing people. It's far easier to operate a military base where no local population can protest, demand jobs, question environmental damage, or vote against your presence. This is the dark logic of modern military basing. Populations are obstacles to be removed, not citizens with rights to be respected and consulted. The Chagossians weren't the first victims of this logic. The U.S. Navy convinced 167 natives of Bikini Atoll to leave in 1946. They were told their land was needed for the good of mankind and to end all world wars, which meant using their islands for nuclear weapons testing. 23 nuclear weapons were detonated on Bikini between 1946 and 1958, rendering it uninhabitable for generations and destroying an entire culture and ecosystem forever. The Chagossian exile fits this pattern when military planners decide they need a place. The people who live there simply don't matter in the strategic calculation. Diego Garcia remains operational today, housing approximately 3,000 to 4,000 military and civilian contractor personnel at any given time, all temporarily stationed there. The base is critical to American operations across the Indian Ocean, Middle East, and South Asia. Described as indispensable by every administration since its construction. But the moral cost is rarely discussed in Washington or London. The human cost is not mentioned in military appropriations, hearings, or strategic planning documents. 1,500 people were forcibly removed. 10,000 descendants live in exile. An entire culture was destroyed, and no one responsible has ever been held accountable. The UK has repeatedly acknowledged that its treatment of the Chagossians was shameful and wrong. But these apologies haven't led to concrete reparations or the right to return. The United States has never admitted to any wrongdoing, never apologized, never contributed to compensation, despite being the driving force behind the entire deportation scheme. In 2002, the UK finally granted Chagossians British citizenship, acknowledging they were British subjects all along, which contradicts the claim they were mere contract laborers. But citizenship without the right to return to your homeland is hollow. It's exile with a passport, not justice or restoration. This is the story of Diego Garcia, the island the UK stole to give to the US, where an entire people were erased for geopolitical convenience. Not colonialism in the traditional sense of extracting resources while governing populations, Colonialism evolved into something more efficient and more brutal: complete removal. And the lesson learned by both governments was clear: if you need land for military purposes, declare it uninhabited and make it true by force.